Welcome to session 9, panel T, Quantified Self, Sociality and Community. Today we have 3 presentations for this panel. First up is Julia Greenberg, right, from Columbia. Then we have Stephen Fortune from the University of Essex, and then I'll have the burdensome task of finishing off with my own presentation, which I'll tell you later. Without further ado, first up is Julia with a talk entitled Searching for Community, Critical Reevaluation of the Quantified Self as a Community. Oh, yes.
Well, thank you guys for coming to the session. I'm thrilled to have you guys here, even though it's the end of the day. So I hope you enjoy it. So in a conference like this, many of you are likely already familiar with the Quantified Self. If you weren't, you most likely are already after the 3 days of talks that we've had. And in this case, I'm talking, of course, about the user group Quantified Self, or Meetup, as it's otherwise referred to, that unites device developers and enthusiasts of personal data in regular conversation. And just a little bit of context for those who are not familiar, originally created by Wired editors Gary Wolf and the magazine's original founder, Kevin Kelly, nearly 10 years ago. So in formulating this concept, the two explicitly modeled the group on early computer engineering forums like the Homebrew Computer Club. Sorry for the fuzzy photograph. It was a 1970s computer hobbyist community that itself harkened back to the 1950s exploits of Tech Model Railroad Club. And I use these terms club, group, meetup intentionally. And in creating a symbolic connection between Quantified Self and these kinds of groups, clubs, the Homebrew Computer Club, like the Homebrew Computer Club, Quantified Self similarly kind of positions itself along the historical spectrum of organizations such as that. So also, besides group, besides club, besides meetup, another word that usually people use to describe Quantified Self, and you'll see in a minute why I pay attention to these terms, is movement. So speaking in part in language of political organizing, Quantified Self is often dubbed a movement where the idea of self-tracking and of gathering personal data takes on the sensibility of social, if not on altogether political purpose. Movement also equally helps to describe the Quantified Self's or to narrate rather the Quantified Self's own popularity that proponents often claim has grown exponentially and even organically, moving as rapidly as a rising tide, as though it was an unstoppable form, or in the marketing language of contagion that people often use these days, it has gone viral, spreading like a virus, as though without regard for any arbitrary national boundaries that one might have. So you can even see during the very first meeting, one of the participants, who's become kind of well-known in the arena since, Tim Ferriss, taking a lot of notes from his first meeting, and even then among his kind of list of thoughts and tools that he had written down, 23andMe, body media, early self-tracking technologies, he wrote the statement, Kevin Kelly and company want to start a movement, as though all but foreshadowing the initiative's future social relevance and popularity. And this framing has become very central in narrating, as a narrating frame for the Quantified Self today. So club, group, meetup, movement, as I've said, each of these words, they need to be taken seriously and unpacked on their own terms. But in this talk, I want to focus attention on one specific word that's become the most salient in describing the Quantified Self as an organizing body, Quantified Self as a community. In my conversation with participants, in discussions with outsiders, and critical reviews and casual references in the press, even during this very conference, the Quantified Self is regularly described as a community. And given that Quantified Self was explicitly modeled on groups like the Homebrew Club, which did have the word club in its title, it's really interesting and important that community specifically has become an almost default way of categorizing the organizing activities of the Quantified Self today. That Quantified Self does indeed constitute a community is often itself taken for granted, accepted almost as a kind of given feature of quantified self, whose own express goal is that of fostering community. And this is Gary Wolf, one of the founders, giving a presentation called An Introduction to the Quantified Self, where he explicitly defines quantified self as a kind of community that he looks to support through his own organizing. It's evaluating quantified self as a community with unique parameters and attributes has also become a very common feature of quantified self scholarship. Indeed, even the very thing that initially drew me to this group, it seemed exciting that I could discover unique practices that so neatly coherent in the space. But in this talk, I want to pause a little bit and think about this term community itself. Why has this term found special resonance in characterizing quantified self? What is its social use? What work does it do? And importantly, what are the stakes of calling quantified self a community? Today, thinking through the social work of terms like community is especially important, as community as a descriptive handle has increasingly itself become a prevalent qualifier in digital discourse more broadly. Of course, notions of personal and social unity have been at home in digital discourse for a very long time. But as Tom Bolstroff recently argued, community appears to have supplanted the more conventional and technical language of networks and networking that's until now widely described how information systems bring people and things together. This shift can be echoed, Bolstroff suggests, even in Mark Zuckerberg's recent manifesto, where he persistently insisted in using the term community. Though the Hollywood film describes Facebook, describing the rise of Facebook, was suitably back then, I think it was 2012, called social network, Zuckerberg himself prefers the word community, and as you can see in this manifesto, which already appears twice, but which Bolstroff calculated he's used a total of 80 times in his in this document. So in this paper, I'd like to zero on. So my broader work explores why fostering community has become increasingly kind of a larger centerpiece of digital work, which quantified self often can be seen to model. But in this paper, I'd like to zero in on one specific aspect of this research and think about why conceptualizing quantified self as a community, and how does that help bolster a market around personal surveillance tools, rather than sequester quantified self as a community from the market, as participants often claim. So within quantified self, in the most general sense, community signals kind of ideas of kinship people feel with others in these circles, in conversation with participants. Quantified self is often presented as a kind of affinity group, as an affiliation of like minds. Oh, I found my people, I hear people tell me. Or this is my tribe, they say, in describing why they feel certain affinity for conversations in these groups. And some attribute this sense of belonging they feel to shared passion for numbers, for engineering, for science. For others, quantified self unites kindred spirits with innate interest in self-monitoring. But in all of this, quantified self is narrated as a kind of convenient handle. Sorry, I'm just going to go back for a second. I'll leave this on the screen, but I'll get to these points. In all of this, quantified self is narrated as a kind of convenient handle. People are often, I hear it noted, have kept records for purposes of self-analysis and self-documentation for millennia. Without quantified self, diabetes patients today might still have had little in common with people, let's say, who life log, who document a large bulk of their lives digitally, but organizing under a common name and often in a mutual space has given them a reason to come together around a shared interest in personal data, the story goes. At other times, community denotes quantified self as a kind of subculture that's itself seen as on the outskirts or to the side of mainstream practices. Oh, the quantified self, that's the lunatic fringe, people say to me when I tell them about my work. Or alternatively, in positive terms, oh, these are the people that are on the cutting edge. But these perspectives readily align with the kind of self-styling of quantified self as a space for experimental ideas and practices. And that word is often explicitly used in the group. as a site of grassroots organizing and advocacy for the socially disenfranchised, the computer geek, the medical oddity, the socially curious, the eccentric technical elite, often seems formed to subvert or to put pressure on establishment science and establishment technology or medicine. Either way, quantified self is frequently staged as this kind of frontier activity, symbolically already located at the borderland of time, of place, of society, always already out of the ordinary. And in all of these, people, tribe, fringe, edge, experiment, even future, they mark a language of border making that defines the terms through which quantified self can cohere as a community. Quantified self as a community trades on these border making practices. And already we can see that this rhetoric produces community one seeks to discover. The language, but as an anthropologist, what's interesting to me is that the language of conceptualizing quantified self as a subcultural community or as a community built on affinity helps to construct this group as a kind of circumscribed site. And in so doing, this framing trades on very conventional anthropological notions of culture itself at one point relegated to kind of a distinct space and place. That's the origins of anthropology. Bronislaw Malinowski, which you see featured here, often seen as a kind of father of modern ethnography, was instrumental in establishing the notion of culture as a bounded idea that needed to be deeply understood on its own terms without, at the same time, in his time, analyzing the dynamics that have placed him both in contact and in opposition to the culture he claimed was separate from his own. So very classically, in his very, very famous book now, Argonauts of the Western Pacific, one of the early chapters began like this. Imagine yourself suddenly set down, surrounded by all your gear, alone on a tropical beach close to a native village, while the launch of or a dinghy which has brought you sails away out of sight. And with these words kind of begins the famous monograph and really even the project of participant observation and ethnography as a project that's engaged in that. And it's a book that's launched in many ways the entire tradition of conceptualizing culture, no less than writing ethnography from the other's point of view. Though constituting a very important intervention in his own time, the position has historically and often presently still assumes to make clean breaks between societies and social groups, frequently likewise reproduced in stable ideas of national imaginaries or notions of dominant cultures, in respect to which multicultural or subcultural identities continue today to develop. Although anthropology's own history, as I've said, is rooted in this view of culture, one that authors Gupta and Ferguson, and I quote them here, critique as that which has enabled the power of topography to successfully, for a period of time, conceal the topography of power. So like the segregated notion of culture that's historically confined people to concrete places, quantified self as a community rehearses this very fiction of the quantified self as a distinct circumscribed social space where difference can be marked, identified, and even visited. At times, quantified self is thus often presented in the kind of mode of salvage anthropology, as a specialized practice whose distinct qualities need to be assembled and preserved. We've kind of talked a lot about this, even during this presentation, about the possible, dissolution of the quantified self, and that itself as a kind of crisis. In all of this, perhaps the most successful and dominant way in which the sense of community is brought together within the group is rhetorically and symbolically, is through being rhetorically and symbolically sequestered from capital. This distinction between quantified self, the community, as something that exists outside or to the side of capital, is a central storytelling function, as Dana Greenfield had called it, of the quantified self. The bifurcation is visible most clearly in the way quantified self meetups are organized. The coded set of practices which indeed come into appearance and indeed reproduce quantified self as an entity. That may be even, we might even call it, using Patchen Markle's words, distinguishing mark as that by which quantified self can become recognized as a space distinct from other tech meetups or gatherings. So replicating this model that Wolf and Kelly have established early on, each meeting is organized around two central themes, the demo hour and the show and tell. A typical event generally opens with the demo hour, where local vendors come to display their self-tracking tools. And this activity kind of sets the stage for the main event, the show and tell presentations that take place later in the evening, only where members kind of talk about their self-tracking experiments. Only when lights are dimmed and those gathered are invited to sit down in chairs or tables arranged. Theater style, the evening formally begins. And during these presentations, people are asked explicitly to frame their presentations in the first person as a personal experience, putting aside members' frequent involvement in Quantified Self, not only as tool users, but also as tool producers. The demo hour and show and tell split the group into vendors and members, where the one becomes in many ways diametrically opposed to the other. Splitting the group activities along these binary poles perpetuates the language of us and them, which effectively defines the boundaries of where community can lie. Show and tell talks are thus highlighted as explicit forum for community organizing, but demo hour is sequestered, or at least rhetorically distanced from Quantified Self proper. Entrepreneurial activity and capital more generally are staged as a feature of Quantified Self, of course, but really a feature of Quantified Self community outreach rather than its counterpart. During the demo hour, entrepreneurs and investors are made welcome as guests rather than as explicit members and contributors to a community at large. Capital is thus largely seen as a kind of constitutive outside against which a feeling and community can cohere, and Wolf's own important curatorial efforts are often framed as a kind of purifying influence, which is seen as his constantly pushing back the covetous gaze of capital. But the rhetorical bounding mirrors the logic of enclosures that's often said to be performed by capital. Echoing anthropology's own historical reification of culture as landlocked, as irrevocably tied to place, at least symbolic place and space, theories have long understood capital as a kind of colonizing force that divides the world into along economic lines. Capital here is seen to move by this kind of terrestrial logic, spatial logic, pushing out limits constantly and boundaries until and its influence as it goes. Similarly, the presentation of Quantified Self as a community nostalgically places the Quantified Self into kind of the spatial, in the similar spatialist logic, where community constructs Quantified Self as an a priori, as a before, as that which exists before capital itself. But theorists have also long pointed out that capital doesn't simply discover borders, especially bodily and national ones. It produces them. The closures of national and cultural boundaries of culture itself are part and parcel of the enclosures produced in the last century and a half, now often enough taken as irrevocably natural. And with respect to Quantified Self, the boundaries between industry and community, is of course also more porous than it appears, and my broader work explores the interconnections. Here, I'll just mention only a few ways in which it intersects. At Quantified Self meetups, journalists rub shoulders with venture capitalists and technology developers, each trying to get a read on Quantified Self as a specialized community, to ascertain what this community might need or want, to even view it as a budding trend that could be monetized or explored or understood. And oftentimes, investment of both effort and money into social tracking tools more broadly in the technology industry is justified on the ground that Quantified Self appears to have the shape of a budding subcultural community. For developers and even media pundits, tracking tools and Quantified Self has to be understood as a community that offers a confined set of practices, a defined space where wider consumer trends could be spied as though in utero as a telling sign of a coming future. And just to conclude, what I want to say is that rather than that which capital simply seeks to constantly exploit or co-opt, it's vital to understand Quantified Self as that which has become constituted by capital, by this very demand to see Quantified Self as a reified community. And instead of capital's ontological precursor, Quantified Self as a community also has to be understood as that which is produced, where borders of the community are, through which, as a mechanism through which borders of the community lie. So while construed as a community explicitly situated outside of economic concerns or industry practices or market dynamics, quantified self has in fact been profoundly shaped, and also itself shapes the very economic and cultural forces that quantified self as a community proposes to hold at a distance. And that's it. I'll end here.
Okay, yeah, so definitely a working title. I think I've just sort of cobbled this one together this morning. Probably need to work on that, but it's no longer looking at a community of interest, which may set me apart from the other two papers on this panel, but I'm hoping that will still be, I think, relatively interesting to the idea of shared spaces between peers. What I'm presenting today is coming from a larger chapter exploring QS data visualization. My overall research is interested in practitioners who've been engaged with or sticking with self-tracking over a long period of time. Just going to grab my water. And there's quite a few creative practitioners who meet that criteria. Another relevant aspect of my approach to kind of front load is that I've been trying to treat self-trackers as inclusively as possible. So figuring any creative practitioner working with self-tracker art as a self-tracker, first and foremost. I've kind of pursued that principally due to my background. I had a practice-based tuition in media art and critical theory simultaneously, and that disposes me to explore or to consider practice as inquiry. And I also tend to view net art and software art as positioned to do more than just provoke and speculate. I see these practices as partly to prior web imaginaries, and we may need those more than ever. So, this paper is going to focus on comparing the representational practices of that former group, artists or creative practitioners, alongside what might be deemed the vernacular visualizations of self-trackers as they present at show and tell events, in my case, the QS London meetup group, QS Labs international events, and the digital media outputs of the QS blog and website. To those sites, I've kind of added a number of exhibitions, art exhibitions that treated the quantified self, self-tracking, metric society and culture between 2015 to 2016, culminating in the Big Bang Data exhibition's visit to London, which has been mentioned yesterday, I believe. Kind of see that Big Bang Data exhibition as a moment where data art went mainstream to a certain extent, where a lot of the practices that preceded it became consolidated and figured alongside other dynamics. So I've used this wider field of QS art exhibits to reflect on the overt intersection of QS with art practice, and that occurred at the exhibition entitled The Art of Self-Tracking in 2015 at the QS Expo, which was an additional day of programming to the regularly scheduled annual conference in California. I tried as much as possible to attend all these exhibitions in situ, but some of them I've recovered from archived material simply because they've occurred in the past and there was no way I could get there. So one of those, slowly coming up. The two sites I'm going to compare are day-to-day data, which happened between 2003 to 2006, and life logging, which happened in the Science Gallery Dublin 2015. I'm interested in seeing how our practice illuminates the representational practices of self-trackers. And I kind of see that the contemporary representational practice of self-trackers exists in continuity with the two things I'm going to pull out of these two sites. The first exhibit, which is day-to-day data, was curated by Ellie Harrison, and life logging was co-curated by Nicholas Felton. 2015, Nicholas Felton, if you don't know, is quite famous as an InfoVis designer, and 2015 was when he ended his series of annual reports. Less well known is that Ellie Harrison and Felton were essentially contemporaries of the life logging artist vanguard, indicated in Ellie Harrison including Felton in her web ring of her seminal project, which was E22, a very early kind of food diary project. So I'm using a very broad definition of data visualization because I'm kind of trying to treat all the infographic media from the various sites I've visited as equivalently as possible. Borrowing this definition from Richard Wright, which he kind of defined to include data artworks within the ambit of what people understood as data visualization. Throughout this talk, I'm probably going to be using the terms artwork and data visualization relatively interchangeably. And our practice intersects with the QS as a literal additional space at the aforementioned QS Expo in 2015. So the two things I'm going to look at from day-to-day data and life logging are also supplementary spaces to the exhibited works. The first is a symposium that kind of wrapped up the day-to-day data project, and in life logging, it was a literal live lab within the overall exhibit, which had a sort of 12-week program of people in residence, and among those in residence was Nicholas Felton. So I'm interested in day-to-day data because it gives insight to a recent history of practitioners engaging in self-tracking practices. This is kind of like personal data practice before Web 2.0, smartphones, and the App Store. In its curator's words, day-to-day data is kind of better understood as a project rather than a series of exhibitions. Began with exploratory workshops and then went to 3 different sites between 2004 and 2006. The reason I'm trying to phrase it as a project rather than just exhibits is that it was quite reflexive about the different sites that the works were occurring within. It featured page-based, net-based, and gallery-specific artworks. And the concluding symposium took place at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in 2006. So, again, thinking of it as a project, the symposium was just intended as one component of the overall project. But it was one where, quote, each speaker discussed the ideas and methodologies surrounding the work that they made for the show. So the symposium kind of offers us something analogous to the show and tell format favoured by the QS today. When I look at the show and tell format, at least what I've observed in London, I'm quite interested in how the data visualizations function within that frame. So when I look to both self-trackers and self-tracking art being exhibited, I became interested in how visual media from one context exists within another. And kind of what I've noticed about the QS show and tells and their use of visualizations is that they're more often than not kind of self-evident props for discussion. It's only rarely I've seen someone kind of query the legibility of visualization or seen someone query the kind of aesthetic preferences for composing one. And that makes a question that occurred at the day-to-day data symposium stick out for me, which was, should the artworks have more thorough instructions? So the audience member, James Ford, posed this question as constructive critique. He had arrived at the exhibit, acquainted with the exhibition documentation available both online and within the publication. And he argued that several of the gallery-based works in the exhibit were enriched with the supplementary knowledge that he had, and then kind of provocatively questioned if the rest of the works could suffice without that additional documentation. It's probably not surprising that the panel of artists kind of pushed back against this critique, and they were very much opposed to the idea that there's any one-size-fits-all recommendation for how you attest to the processes that precede an artwork. But they did kind of get on board with the gist of the critique, especially Abigail Reynolds. And she kind of answered his question with a question, which is, how do you make the rest of the thought processes available without cluttering up the first view that a gallery goer gets? And she was quite keen that that view could be retaken. So I find that quite an interesting reflection through word, given how other disciplines approach data visualization, especially how different disciplines relate to clutter or extraneous elements within the frame of a visualization. So Reynolds wants a view that can be retaken, not any single authoritative view. Something I've been contrasting to this is work by Cho et al., who tried to determine what data-driven insights look like in a visual form from a corpus of QS show and tell talks. And that research noted quite a high incidence of annotated visualizations, instances of external context and uncaptured data intruding into a neat infographic. And the final thing I'm going to take out from day-to-day data is that the artists' response very much align with a robust defense of aesthetic knowledge in the face of these data sense-making disciplines I've gestured to, which is advanced by Thomas Bjornstein. Hope I'm getting that right. And I'm going to quote, which is, data-oriented artworks and practices are often able to engage recipients in a mode of aesthetic experience that eventually generates knowledge and insights, but does so in a much less instrumental manner. And the other thing the other thing that Bjornstein and day-to-day data share is quite a bounded context. They're arguments that are intended to apply to the art gallery setting alone. Nonetheless, I think we can consider the day-to-day data symposium exchange as articulating an unresolved problematic. I'd see this problematic as native to art contexts, but is of relevance to QS representational practices. And it's one, I think, that is raised by the intersection of art practice and the QS. And that problematic rephrased is how and whether to make the thought processes that precede a data visualization more available to viewers, either viewers to whom the data visualization is presented or who share space with that data visualization. Like outside of the gallery setting, we might locate this problematic within the ambit or the question of tacit knowledge. So later, when I refer to this problematic, I'm probably just going to shorten it to a tacit knowledge problematic. And combining day-to-day data in Bjornstein gives us one response, if not really an answer, and that's to resist imperatives to provide instructions if that reflex would diminish any of these possible encounters with a data visualization, which is immersion, puzzling through, productive confusion, dwelling upon, and retaking views. So I'm going to jump forward 9 years now to life logging, which was hosted at the Science Gallery, February to April 2015. So where day-to-day data preceded the mobile web and Web 2.0, life logging was among a number of exhibitions that treated the QS alongside the advent and advance of these technologies into our kind of contemporary experience. And Nicholas Felton was among the curators of this exhibition, and if you don't know much about his work, this will serve as a relatively okay primer on what he's done. At the outset, though, you do need to know that he's a much esteemed information visualizer, and I'm going to abbreviate information visualization to InfoVis henceforth. I'm going to use InfoVis to designate something different to the broad definition of data visualization I mobilized earlier. InfoVis is something closer aligned to the schools of thought of Colin Ware and Edward Tufte and the entire discipline of visual analytics. And these are approaches that tend to see the activity of data visualization as an exercise in rendering complexity, if not comprehensible, then at least tractable. And for instance, that research of Cho et al. That tried to discern data-driven insights is very much indebted to those epistemological presuppositions. So in addition to having, I think, three of the 10 reports exhibited at the gallery, Felton was also in residence in this thing that was called the Live Lab. It was very well attended, and this further indicates the esteem in which he is held in practitioner circles such as design. But it also kind of gives us an idea of what format this live lab could take. He was in the gallery ostensibly working on his final ever report, but he was also available to help any newcomers visualize their data. And it's quite an interesting proposal to have a feted InfoVis practitioner working on their process as a larger exhibit contextualizing that same practice transpires and unfolds around them. So we can see Felton's residency as another attempt in making the thought processes preceding data visualization more accessible to gallery goers or maybe lay users. And an invigilator at the exhibit informed me that the residency drop-in sessions mostly resolved to demonstration of applications, among them the Moves app. Attendees were shown how to extract data from the app and then visualize it. And this might seem like an incidental detail, but I'd like to pull out several threads from it. So we'll start with this app in question, Moves. The Moves app is a really good object for considering Felton's wider impact on digital culture. Moves was acquired by Facebook in 2014, and Felton himself was famously involved in the Facebook timeline redesign of 2010 to about 2011. Together, these point to how dynamics of self-tracking became encoded into social media, and also how post-Web 2.0 platforms branched out into self-tracking through lateral acquisitions, which is something that I think Jose van Dijk is going to detail in the Platform Society book that's maybe out or forthcoming. But secondly, the Moves app can be adjudged as part of a very definite visual convention with respect to data visualization, aptly illustrated by this Tumblr that collects an archive of iOS QS apps. So combining those two together, I read Felton's practice as indicative of the wider digital media context that QS is today situated within, context characterized by such terms as platformization and appification. And I also believe that critiques of user experience design, which I'm going to abbreviate as UXD henceforth, additionally illuminate the impact Felton's practice has had. Felton's involvement with Facebook, basically his aesthetic influence and impact on applied self-tracking technologies, are in direct dialogue with software studies, critiques of user experience design. So I haven't got much time, but 2 studies are instructive in this regard. One is Megan Sapners-Ankerson's work on web design before and after the dot-com bust, and Michael Dieter's work on responsive design. These studies point to the success that UXD has accomplished in large part through a particular approach to aesthetics, and that approach is characterized respectively through professionalization and instrumentalization. The Turing Complete user essay of net artist Olia Lialana kind of surmises the trust of UXD critiques as they apply to self-tracking, particularly title case self-tracking, given the continuity that has already been noted that QS has with the personal computing imaginaries. So Lialana argues that the computer user is being effaced in favor of consumer figurations of end users, and that UXD is very instrumental in this regard. So I'd like to consider the acquisition of Lapka, an ostensible sensor startup, by Airbnb in 2015 as encapsulating the UXD approach to software users, one with particular salience to the QS. Like the acqui-hire fate that potentially awaits any struggling wearable vendor, like say Jawbone at present, Lapka were acquired and their talent merged into Airbnb with all production of their prior peripherals suspended. But few outlets that reported on that acquisition delved into how many of Lapka's instruments were minimal viable products versus design fiction speculations. Gary Wolf himself expressed surprise on learning that the Southern Oregon meetup had actually got hands-on with one of these kits. And we then consider how the CEO of the company spoke of the acquisition. We get a different sense of what this was all about. Lapka were acquired for demonstrating a deft touch in designing experiences for end user consumption. Their success is also why I'm pretty circumspect on speculative design as a critical resource for understanding the QS. Lapka kind of represents an ideal endpoint of UXD, and they indicate how the discipline is opinionated on the previously noted tacit knowledge problematic. It's when asked how to make thought processes available, the answer is don't. Instead, obfuscate aesthetically. So I've tried to use Felton's residency to contextualize his impact on self-tracking representational practices respective to the appearance of appified data visualizations today. And that's that a certain visual register for translating data into experience has become widespread and affixed, and UXD critiques help us understand that a little bit more. But I didn't really get a chance to show you much of the day-to-day data artworks, but it's far more bespoke and bricolage oriented. I think that spirit still persists today. I think this example from the QS Gallery blog series illustrates this. So as I discern continuity between the vernacular QS data viz and the UXD cases previously, it follows that both these aesthetic approaches are relevant to apply to today's self-tracking practices. And that's pretty noteworthy given the time that's elapsed between the two. So the major and most remarked upon techno-societal change separating day-to-day data and life logging exhibit is the proliferation of context where personal data can be produced about a person. These new contexts can be understood, at least in part, through the technological dynamics present in the world of 2015 that were absent during 2004, many of which relate to the advent of the smartphone, as other talks have remarked upon, namely the mobile web, apps, and the platform paradigm that followed in Web 2.0's wake. But at a higher level, we can also understand this change as owing to the advance of software into more areas of our day-to-day lives. This is termed softwareization by scholars like Lev Manovich and David Berry, but essentially they're useful, but they are basically academic reflections on that essay that software is eating the world and what are the ramifications of that. So as a discipline, even though it's really kind of like an ill-fitting designator for UXD, UXD's approach to aesthetics differs from the view of aesthetic experience within day-to-day data. I contend that day-to-day data aligns with Thomas Bjornstein's knowledge-generating definition of aesthetic experiences, and that's something that he positions against instrumentalization. Conversely, UXD embraces a certain instrumentalization of aesthetic experience in much the same way as the QS show and tell is accommodating of the startup or venture capitalist spirit. And UXD is also opposed to the possible encounters with a data visualization that day-to-day data championed. Immersion, puzzling through, and productive confusion, they don't really figure in there. And this relates to what David Berry's interface criticism notes, is that, quote, disorientation underneath the surface is insulated from the user. But the thing about both these cases I've shown is that the thought process that preceded the data visualization objects are either unavailable or not immediately available. So where the cases differ is the disposition to that unavailability. So in day-to-day data, the thought processes that preceded and informed each exhibited work were deemed recuperable through reassembly via the exhibition's multi-format documentation, the website, the publication. That's all quite consistent with day-to-day data's approach to data aesthetics. It was an overarching project focused on the iterative processes of interpretation and reinterpretation that attend obtaining data from daily experience. It was a project that embraced a multi-site vision of an exhibit's purpose, and most importantly, it posited an inquisitive gallery goer, an active viewer who could and would traverse the different contexts which the project spawned. And if we consider how the thought processes were made available within life logging, it's quite different. It was through a workshop that was physically nested or encapsulated within a fixed abode exhibition. And I've kind of persisted with stating making thought processes available rather than saying mediating thought processes. And that's because I believe there's work to be done on whether intermediaries and intermediation are compatible with making thought or tacit knowledge available in self-tracking. I think these incompatibilities register on the N of 1 scale of QS and with respect to the fiscal prerogatives of scale software solutions and platforms. Matthew Fuller describes platforms such as Uber and Airbnb, and we could probably add Talkspace to that list, as operating by disintermediation, which is occupying the space of mediation between buyers and sellers, supply and demand. So like disintermediation describes the reduction of intermediaries to somehow unlock value. But when it comes to the sort of knowledge that QS strives for, it merits asking if this arc of disintermediation is desirable. And given how disintermediation and occupation interrelate, I think it's significant that the space Felton physically occupied during his life logging accorded time and value to the extract, transform, load, or ETL process. So like where agents of softwareization, aspirant platforms, and wearable platforms chief among them, may seek to occupy spaces of mediation, unavoidable aspects of self-tracking data practice still demand their own spaces. So ETL is a very mundane and quite old set of computational tasks that precede most data operations and certainly most data visualizations, often in iterative fashion and frequently by scripts that people just knock up themselves. I think Thomas Blomstedt Christensen said as much in his talk yesterday. And I think it's within this ETL process that the aesthetic experiences of day-to-day data, puzzling through and dwelling upon, compositional immersion even, still inhere for most self-trackers on an everyday level for now. And I stress the for now because I think the UXD approach to aesthetics has to be considered ascendant in self-tracker software use. And if we're seeking quotidian locations for data sense, as Deborah Lupton called it, then I think ETL is one place to begin. Felton's ETL tutorials indicate that even today, when a self-tracker wishes to combine app data with any other sources of self-track data, they exit the aesthetic space claimed and commodified by user experience design and enter another. And equally important in this formulation is entertaining aesthetic knowledge as something more encompassing than just those techniques tightly coupled to our practice, something closer to an everyday aesthetics. To exhibit something is actually to make it available. The aesthetic experience which data artworks engage recipients in, I think, can be understood in terms of the space of inquiry that an exhibited artwork opens. This space is distinct from the other spaces of exchange that have to date featured in the QS, which is why I think the overt intersection with art practice that occurred in 2015 with the Art of Self-Tracking exhibition is noteworthy. So while not explicitly related to data visualization, I do discern a growing space for the sharing of just such tacit knowledge outside the framing conventions of the show and tell at recent QS international events. Both the 2015 conferences debuted how-to sessions, for instance. So I think it's worth considering the spaces additional to the show and tell in continuity with precursor art exhibits like day-to-day data, namely in terms of this space of inquiry that we might think of our exhibits as opening. That's a space sustained by an understanding of aesthetic experience as a non-instrumentalist route to knowledge acquisition. And what I also hope I've intimated is that practices of software use can themselves be entertained as an aesthetic space. And to conclude, I think the question that these coexisting aesthetics approaches and spaces raise is which approach is more resonant with reflexivity and critical thinking.
Okay, so I have the onerous task of concluding this session, and of course I'm conscious that we are all tired after a few days of intense talking and discussing, and therefore it might sound as bad news that my paper has no slides, and it's going to be quite substantially theoretical in a way, so apologies in advance. But essentially this paper is, for me, I conceive this as a trade union between the work I've been doing in the past few years, which I'll explain a little bit about, and what I want to do next. And in some way it is also a standalone. It is something that I see as a sort of reflection in and of itself, which goes a little bit out of my usual sort of comfort zone of where I locate myself in theoretical, from a theoretical perspective in relation to digital culture and work, which has been my main topic of research so far. And it is very much a work in progress. So that's the promise, it's the last preamble. So that I am basically coming here sharing a few reflections and a few ideas and hoping that these may be interesting and to get to discuss a few of those ideas with you for the actual writing of the paper, which is initiated but not completed. So preamble finished. What I'm going to talk about is essentially trying to understand metrics, online metrics, from the perspective of social theory. I'm a sociologist, and my work has been so far mainly focused on the idea of looking at what changes with work when it comes to be intermediated with digital technologies, digital environments, and metrics. And essentially it has focused on the idea of reputation. So my book that has come out last year, which I really advise you not to read, is a book that has reflected on the role of reputation as what I define as a cultural consumption of value in context of the meeting between digital media and work. So essentially the concept that kind of keeps together what are the forms of work that are prior to the digitization. So in many ways freelancers were my starting point, and the way in which in order to get a job as a freelancer, you need to develop this sort of reputation across networks, or reputational capital as a form of social capital, and linking that with environments like online labor markets, like Upwork, where you have very much a tangible and visible metric of a reputation score that determines or in some way affects your capacity to get a job. So this is the work I've been doing. I've argued around this in terms of, as I said, a cultural conception of value, which is also very much a form of triangulation between the possibility to get a job and social capital and trust. So it's a sociological understanding of this, which has in a way a Marxist understanding, because it links into the idea of digital labor and things that in some way Chris has talked about yesterday as well. So this is where I come from, and out of these reflections, of course, metrics play an important role, because the more we talk about digital labor, the more we talk about digital work, we talk about a context in which there are online forms of tangible approximation of social capital that are visible and are very much instrumental to some purposes. One may be, and mostly is, getting a job. Others are emerging and essentially reflect forms of control of work, of evaluation of work, of the amount of money one can make, and I'm referring, for instance, to reputation systems that emerge and have emerged and sort of make the backbone of the Uber app, for instance. So the way in which you rate a driver is very much a chance, or like the way in which the app can trust the worker that she has done a good job and will continue to do so over time. So through this work, essentially I've come to write a paper, which is another one, not this one, which I've finished, that essentially argues that the work that takes place out of the maintenance and management of these online metrics for digital workers is essentially, or should be seen, as a way to rematerialize the forms of immaterial labor that Maurizio Lazzarato has talked about from the sort of autonomous Marxist point of view. And to do so, I very much rely on the idea of a sort of tangible and visible aspects of things like emotional labor, and use a bit of the work that I'm sure you're familiar with, which is the work that Caroline Gerlitz has done, defining this as a like economy. And the quote that I have with me here, which I'll show you in a second, it is very interesting in that sense. And Caroline and Anne Helmond, in their paper, talk about the like economy as an infrastructure that comes across as facilitating a social web experience, but partakes in creating an alternative fabric of the web in the back end, in which social interaction is instantly metrified and multiplied, and which connects insights from web analytics with individual user profiles for, sort of skipping a little bit, purposes of making the social, the traceable, and the marketable affect visible and utilizable for a variety of purposes. Now, this is interesting because in a way it can be applied much wider than the context of work, and that's the basic argument that I'm doing here. So it can be applied in general to digital social environments. So social media, social network sites, app, wherever we have a digital environment in which social relations are at stake, that's virtually the very same logic. And I think what we are missing in this literature and debate, which has very much related around the idea of affect. A lot of people have talked about affect, from Melissa Gregg and others. I think Melissa Gregg, for me, is the main point of reference there, is an attempt to understand what is the main cultural aspect to understand these metrics. What are the role of these metrics, and what kind of cultural dynamics their presence induces us into being, and what kind of action derives from that. So in order to understand this, I resort an old text which is from a German economist called Thorsten Veblen, which I'm hopeful some of you at least are familiar with, that has been recently reprised and taken back a few times in the literature in a scattered manner. Thorsten Veblen wrote a book in 1898, if I'm correct, which was called The Theory of the Leisure Class. And in that book, there is an idea that essentially the leisure class, what he defines as a leisure class, which is what we now might call the 1%, so the ultra-rich, were involved in a social practice of display of their wealth, which he called conspicuous leisure and conspicuous consumption. So in order for the wealthy to be recognized as such and for their status to be confirmed and reaffirmed, they were to display their leisure and their activities and the consumption related to it in forms that are visible, ostensible. And he defines them as conspicuous. So things that are actually a bit of a waste in a way. So the definition of waste is interesting in Veblen because in a sense it's the display of something that has no use value at all, other than the display of wealth. And it's done through leisure activities, so something that other people with less money could not do, or consumption, the consumption of goods that other people could not afford. Now, I think that this very notion of conspicuousness is what we are missing to understand the role of online metrics within digital environments. And a few of the things that I've heard over this conference can easily apply to these reasonings. I'm assuming it's not completely foolish, which I'm relying on you to tell me if it's the case. And I'm trying to say, essentially, that this applies in a way that is quite different from the way in which this work around conspicuous consumption has been reprised recently. A few times this has been reprised in the most recent literature. One case is an article by Adam Stoneman on the leftist magazine Jacobin, which has looked at what you have on the screen here, which is a phenomenon that has emerged as rich kids of Instagram, which is a display of pictures from the 1%, which you can look at yourself if you wish. Essentially, they are kids of very wealthy families, not necessarily well known, but very rich, that use Instagram to display their wealth. Now, I argue that essentially this logic is just one side of the story. So this tells something that can very easily read with a Veblennian approach, but there is much more to that. And the argument I make, in essence, is that conspicuousness can and should be read as, in a similar fashion to what Frederick Jameson in the 1980s used to read the cultural traits that were sort of the backbone of the idea of postmodernism that we had. So a cultural dominant. The way in which we approach metrics online and the way in which they come to intervene within the social relationships of people is very much a case of conspicuousness. So what appears out of the interaction between relationships and the metrics that metrify them is that they reward conspicuousness. The more conspicuous the relationships are, and the more they bring purposeful advantages. Think about it. I'll give you a simple example because this is already too complicated. Think about how we book an Airbnb. And I'm sure that in this room there is someone with, who is hosted at an Airbnb, I'm sure. This is most normally taken as through a reputation system. So you go and look at the pictures. The pictures are something that in some way will have to catch your eye according to the taste that you think you will have to have in your ideal home for your small vacation. And then you go and look at the reviews. And if the reviews are ostensibly good, you can trust this person to host you in your flat or to get you the whole flat if you're lucky. So this is the very same logic. And why the system lives is because at the end of your stay, you will be required to produce content. You will be required to produce a review. You will be required to sort of reproduce this conspicuousness for the sake of others who will have to go and see that, and they will base their own evaluation on the very same logics. Now, if you want to visualize that as a map, I think that this idea kind of triangulates with, on the one hand, with the idea that is in Veblen, which is called economy of display. So this is an economy of display. This is a context in which display becomes an economic device for purposes of profit in some cases, rent in the case of Airbnb, and an economy of feelings that is very much at the idea of, well, at the heart of ideas of publicity and publics online. For instance, the work of Tsitsipa Pakarissi and the work of, the idea that I like in that work is the idea of online social environments as environments wherein we are confronted with the mediation of feelings. So these come together, and the idea of metrics, or the like economy, can be reframed culturally as the idea of a context in which conspicuousness gets rewarded. And the work of conspicuousness is what drives social action at sort of at the heart of it. Another reference I rely when I make this analogy is a beautiful article which I really advise you to read by a guy called Noam Muran, that has been published in late 2016 on Theory, Culture and Society, which is a Veblennian reflection on brands. Now, the fact that this has been applied to luxury brands, Alice Marwick also mentions Veblen in one of her last articles, is one part of the story, and that's where I am heading in the second part of my talk. Essentially, Veblen describes this as conspicuous leisure. So whatever we do in this ecosystem, and even these guys here in the rich kids of Instagram, are showing leisure activity. And now the word leisure, from a perspective of someone that has worked on digital labor, indicates something quite specific. So the idea of labor. the idea that online social environments through user-generated content are environments in which leisure is put at value for some entity, in which case platforms. User-generated content in the idea of digital labor is the performance of free labor, in a way. And this is very interesting for me because essentially we are aching, the use of term consciousness is the missing link between making sure that we are, it's a missing link between understanding labor and how leisure has become integral part of an economy of feelings that valorizes leisure and the reproduction of signifiers of leisures through it. I'm sure it's enough complicated and didn't get anything at all. But if you bear with me, essentially this is displayed in a number of aspects. I mean, the reputation systems that we talked about, the notion of status that is very much in Alice Marwick's work, and a few of the things that Veblen wrote in that very old book still are quite interesting for us to understand what's going on in social media. I'm quoting from the original author just to sort of go towards the end. The observation, page 60-61, he says, the observation of many persons who have no other means of judging others' reputability than the display of goods. This is very much Instagram. This is very much Uber. This is very much Airbnb. And Uram uses a nice wording here when he talks about Veblen as key in trying to make us understand that social media are essentially the manifestation of a transformation in the cultural conditions of display. So the way in which we display things is not just for the sake of leisure or for the sake of profit of a third entity, a platform or a party. It's very much the cultural dominant, Jameson, of the activity that we do on social media. And again, another interesting concept in Veblen is that all of this is a form of valorization that stems out of the signifier work that transient observers, that's a term that Veblen uses, do, which is very much what social media are doing, and what we do on social media. We are transient Airbnb users. We are transient observers of our Facebook friend newsfeed. We put a like every now and then. We are transient observers of, for instance, recruiters are transient observers of our LinkedIn profiles that go there and look at what we have on there, or just Googling us, have a look at what's about us, and as transient observers make evaluations on what is ostensibly visible of us instead of looking at the whole picture. In many cases, but it has happened. I've been involved in a study where we found out with a survey that around 60% of job ads or job calls, the first thing that recruiters do is Google the person and discard a consistent number of candidates on the basis of the first-hand information and the first impression that they can derive online from them. So it is an interesting point, and I think it is an interesting point, and I'm going to conclude here so we have a bit of a chat, because it fits into essentially what Uram calls a minimal condition of the game itself. So in order to play the game of social media, in order to play the game of platforms, we need to sort of put ourselves in the middle of a game of conspicuousness, which is not only for brands, it's also for us. It's also for each and every single one of us, because we are part of an ecosystem that valorizes this visibility, that valorizes feelings in and that's the missing element in the literature. It doesn't simply valorize feelings, it valorizes feelings in combination with valorizing display. Of course, there's a provocation in all of that, and the provocation in which I end, which is the fact that in Veblen, this is very much linked to the idea of class, which is a term that we have stopped talking about in many ways, because of a number of reasons. One of them, and one that is my sort of more at the heart of what I think here, is that we come out of a period of time through the rise of the creative industries that has led us to associate class to lifestyle. So the idea that we can portray a lifestyle of a creative will make us a creative class person. And from a sociological perspective, this is very difficult to accept, because a creative class person doesn't exist. What exists is a person that is belonging to a certain class on the basis of a number of specific criteria, which are, pretty precise, and one can discuss endlessly about it. It's not just simply because of a lifestyle. But if it may be true that the 1% is a class, is a leisure class, and we are in a process of actually, through all this, making this visible. I mean, the 1% is pretty conspicuous online through places like this blog, The Rich Kids of Instagram, and Instagram itself. Maybe the whole point of the internet, which was democratizing access, actually renders us in the position of sort of not seeing that all of this is also affecting class understandings and the way in which these this sort of class conceptions are construed in the minds of our of us and our students in many cases as well. So I'm sure it was very, very chaotic and meaningless, but I hope it was fine anyway. And I'll, of course, welcome any comment from the audience, even a comment like, don't publish this paper. It's absolutely fine. Okay? Thank you very much.
Really, really interesting papers. Alessandro, I really just wanted to kind of take you up on this.
Go ahead.
This claim that we don't talk or think about class anymore, or that we're not aware of kind of the class implications of these modes of display. So I don't know if you want to maybe just flesh out your thinking on this further, because it seems to me that a lot of us talk about inequality and are concerned with expressions thereof.
Yeah. First point is I have no specific thoughts, because that's the kind of plan for the future, to sort of try and understand a little bit more of that through an empirical study that underpins a few of these ideas. And you're right, actually, it's a good point. We talk a lot about inequality, but not class. I think they're two slightly different. We're probably talking about a similar thing, but with a slightly different angle, let's say. The kind of class I'm talking about, and again, it's more complex than this. It's, for instance, the class relations that develop out of the relationships of production, a la Marxist. Which means, for instance, that if you work on a platform, there is a clear difference if you work as a graphic designer on Upwork or as a delivery courier. And how would you call it? That difference is a difference of class, in a way, because one is a lowly skilled job that could potentially be seen as a working class, and the other one would be a creative class. But is that a difference of class? Maybe not. Maybe it's a difference of other forms of class, of relationships of production which are at play within this context. And of course, Chris knows a little bit about that too, but we can talk about it in another occasion. So it's a question for me. I have no specific answer, but I think that if class relations develop out of relationships of production, which we can take as an assumption that we share, then if those relationships of production change because of the internet, we need to go and see what's going on in there. Because maybe something has changed, maybe not. Maybe it's okay to be 1/99%. But that's early 20th century, or like late 19th century, which still it's not okay, I think. Did it make sense? Pretty much. Yeah. There's one there and one here, so maybe there. Yeah.
I just want to build on that. Like,
yep.
I do think when that came up, I think it cuts through all three presentations for me, and particularly, like the idea of quantified self meetups. Like, as someone who co-runs a meetup space, you had mentioned people come in, journalists come in, and then investors come in, and they're trying to see how they can cull what's valuable out of a community resource. And similarly, like the display of these, like artworks of quantified self-data and self-logging. Like it seems to me, I'm curious as to your thoughts, since it's been more explicitly touched upon with this last presentation, your thoughts on kind of that seduction of the upper class lifestyle, like the rich kids of Instagram that goes along with all of these technologies.
I mean, for my part, it's not simply kind of about rich kids of Instagram. It's almost a kind of imperative of a professional lifestyle. So, meetup communities and people who organize meetup communities do so not only out of their own self-interest, which obviously there are communities around interest groups, but the communities that I'm kind of part of, the technically oriented communities, are also already oriented with one eye towards a kind of industry as a performance, that they can display. And it's almost a Weberian kind of logic where on the one hand, we need to perform a kind of playfulness, right? This is not really work. This is not just my job. This is my passion. And it's a kind of like desire to cultivate a career that almost exceeds occupation. It has to be a life work, right? And meetup communities are part and parcel of that narrative. But at the same time, that's why I feel like the distinctions between leisure and work, as though one occupies the other, don't really hold, because they've already always been in play. They're kind of like two sides of the same coin that become displayed. So, and on the other hand, you have to professionalize that occupation. Your whole life becomes a kind of preparation for an occupation, and you can, even there are lots of interesting theories writing around this demand to display as a preparation exactly for that potential employer that might be looking. And there's some interesting work around how people now still increasingly feel the need to standardize their media presence like a brand would. We need to have I have to have an identity, an aesthetic that carries through my media channels, not like I have one side of my personality here and another side of my personality there for different audiences. It's part of my kind of bigger staging. So that's kind of what I'm interested in, and kind of thinking through these intersections rather than sequester these activities as though they're separated out from these broader shifts.
I guess I'm thinking of like when Don Nafis wrote in Biosensing that there's yet to be any kind of QS account from the margins, that the people who tend to go to these things are probably, if we were to entertain them as class, it would be quite high up the class. Who did the Pioneer Communities presentation on the first day? His paper looks at both the maker movement, the open data movement, and then the QS is like equivalent Pioneer communities. And I think a lot of those communities are animated by developers who are in well remunerated day jobs, and often they're day jobs that like are soul sucking, and then they try and do work in their pursuits afterwards. And I kind of always think of those communities in terms of the mockery that I think it's Garnet Hertz did of the Make movement with his big Made magazine, just showing that like it's kind of people getting into this in a very hobbyist fashion, but without engaging with like who are the other users who are maybe not in a position to develop.
Thanks, really great papers. And I was just the quote from Malinowski is really nice, and I thought it made me think that I'd maybe be slightly more terrified of being left by the dinghy in the in next to the pool of the Instagram kids. They might be a bit more worrying group to hang around with. But what I was thinking about as well is obviously you talk about aesthetics a lot, and obviously that's a lot of what's the issue here. But it strikes me that the groups that you're talking about in terms and the way that Zuckerberg talks about community ethics is a big part of this. and he just did his kind of tour around America recently, didn't he? Did you read about this? Where he went and visited lots of people to talk about community, almost as if he was doing a presidential run or something. And which
he
he might well
situates
do.
himself as a kind of global leader, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
The national boundaries almost become too arbitrary.
Exactly, yeah, and it seems like it's that's a kind of like you were saying, that it has to take over your whole life. It's got to be part of your kind of life project. But it's also got. It seems like your thoughts on this. It seems like it's got to have this social good element to it, and that always in a lot of those in the to some extent in the QS communities, but it's there implicit in the community that you're working for the community, and certainly in the kind of the in a lot of that Silicon Valley culture, it's we're doing this stuff that's for the good, but at the same, but it's fully integrated with their version of capitalism as well, and of profit making.
Totally.
Yeah, I don't really thought about that. Alessandro, philanthro capitalism kind of thing, and whether that's is there an ethics to the kids of Instagram, or is it just aesthetics?
Well, on aesthetics, I think that the point that one of the points that I didn't make, which of course was a challenge for me to try and also draw all these thoughts together, is that this amounts very much to one of the things that Jameson says in that article on postmodernism when he talks about aesthetic populism. And that sort of idea, the idea that postmodernism is a form of aesthetic populism, and in some way that is the kind of ultra display of that aesthetic populism. So the fact that you go into a display of a sort of form of aesthetic that is then judged by how many likes it gets, or it gets judged about how much attention it gets. And then hence the idea of conspicuousness, to try and explain all that through a process that is intimately economic and not necessarily, economic and cultural, and not necessarily limited to, an attention economy for like the managerial people who call it like that, or branding, which is, and I'm referring to your earlier point, which is very much the case. But the point is that having written about all this and sort of argued that is work, and as you say, it becomes part of an embodiment of a professional life. I still find personally myself at odds with not distinguishing between leisure and work, because one of the two is paid and the other is not, at least normally. So it's difficult for me to try and not to go back and draw the distinction. Although
I mean, you were saying, I think in many ways I agree, but leisure is not kind of an essentialized category that exists on its own. It's produced in tension with other
of course
other concepts, and the leisure class of kind of the aristocratic leisure class, it had its own understanding of leisure, not distinct. It cannot be abstracted from concepts of work, right? So they are never. There's always fluidity between these terms. There, in the sense that in that context, there are kind of like classic binaries that determine each other. There is no concept of leisure outside of a concept of labor, but.
Sorry to interrupt. Sorry. That original distinction, and that's in Veblen too. It's that the leisure class refuses work because it's something that the upper class doesn't do.
Yeah.
So you see why it kind of keeps coming together as a tension, at least, and which I still find fascinating and useful and necessary to research, as along the lines of what you're saying. But then, of course, maybe different from a different perspective.
If I can just add something to the social good comment, I think it's also interesting and important to situate it in kind of different discourse, and I'm not kind of the only one to say this, but social good, corporate social good. First of all, even the bizarre term like for-profit philanthropy, which actually exists as a concept, is a strange notion. But the corporate idea of kind of, especially in technical settings, it's become such a kind of motto around which to rally, is really civilizing discourse by another name, right? That they'd already kind of there's always a social good going out towards the other, right, that you're trying to reach, and it recreates a very, very familiar narrative. And not to say that motive is not genuine. I think a lot of times it is motivated by desire to intervene in positive ways, but I think as critical theorists, we also need to kind of remember the history within which it's couched, and it just restages these kinds of global hierarchies. From where does social good flow? From the Silicon Valley, billionaires that now envision a kind of unified, globalized framework, right? And that globalization also, it's something that I'm kind of trying to work out in this paper that I'm writing in Community, that vision of globalization as a kind of unified entity, right? Not just community on a local scale, but community on a universal scale. We are a big community. That's what Zuckerberg is saying. The global is the community. There's no, partitions. It's just a big seamless us, right? That's a certain vision, a universalizing vision that's, again, very familiar, and you can kind of rework that, but that goes part and parcel along the line with how people often conceptualize data and the way data flows and interoperates and can be aggregated at scale. These can or should data sets be made commensurate to one another? It's a big question whether or not they can be, but that kind of move, again, kind of naturalizes that language of data as not only powering, but surrounding the globe, kind of taking in worldly kind of concepts as a unit. So it's interesting to think through some of these, definitely.
But this is just that, like, new ways of doing something that we have always been doing, as in showing off. I mean, the upper class has been showing off their wealth. Like in ancient Greece, they were organizing theater for the populace, not because they were nice people and wanted to educate the populace, it was just to show off their wealth. I mean, okay, now we do it with Instagram, and is it really about, a new aesthetic of the old, a new way of showing off, basically, using this media? But at the same time, I question whether that aesthetic comprises art, because art in some senses tries to, well, for me at least, it tries to make you think about things or create some rapport with a social issue or with the artist. So is the portrayal of big data of the self in graphs and timelines create a question about social issues or a rapport with a person generating, apart from the fact that it is displaying blobs and it's like I am not entirely, like I'm questioning. I just don't know the answer.
We have 1 minute, I think. No more.
Yes. Actually, we don't. We don't. Yeah, we have to get going.
But it's an interesting question. I think. We'll take it to our own Friday evenings.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, private discussion.
Thank you.